As part of Scholastic Book Fair week, we're traveling back to 1980 when kids across America could walk into their school library or cafeteria and discover a paperback called The Dynamite Book of Ghosts and Haunted Houses. I was too young to see this book when it first came out, but I've often wondered what the paranormal lovers who came before me must have felt when they first spotted it on those crowded book fair shelves. Inside were stories of phantom hitchhikers, haunted churches, and ghostly houses, all presented as true. The author claimed the stories came from newspapers and eyewitnesses. But 45 years later, many of those sources remain a mystery. Who was Margaret Ronan? Where did these stories come from? And how much of this forgotten ghost book was history? And how much was legend? Today, we're taking a closer look at the Dynamite Book of Ghosts and Haunted Houses. Hello and welcome to Haunted Thursday, a special series part of the Halloween podcast. I am your host, Lyle Perez. Each week on Haunted Thursday, we explore haunted locations, ghost stories, paranormal mysteries, and the strange history that keeps them alive. Sometimes that means investigating an old house or a forgotten legend. Other times it means tracing a story back to the place where people first discovered it. Because ghost stories don't just live in abandoned buildings and dark roadsides. Sometimes they live in newspaper clippings, family stories, and the pages of a book that sat on a school library shelf decades ago. The Dynamite Book of Ghosts and Haunted Houses was published by Scholastic in 1980 as part of its Dynamite line of books. The back cover asks readers a simple question: do you believe in ghosts? It promises stories of haunted houses, strange encounters, and unexplained events from across the United States. Inside, Margaret Ronan collected stories about phantom hitchhikers, haunted churches, mysterious apparitions, and places that had already become part of American ghost lore. Readers would encounter locations such as Resurrection Cemetery near Chicago, Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, the Whaley House in California, the White House, and the Myrtles Plantation in Louisiana. The book also included a chapter called Haunted Houses You Can Visit, giving young readers real places they could look up on a map. In her author's note, Ronan explained that she had spent years collecting these stories. She wrote that some came from newspaper clippings, while others came directly from people who claimed to have experienced the events themselves. She also admitted that she wasn't completely sure whether she believed in ghosts, leaving readers to decide for themselves. What's interesting is how little information the book provides beyond that. There are no footnotes, no bibliography, and no list connecting individual stories to their sources. The reader knows that newspapers played a role and that witnesses shared their experiences with Ronan. But the trail largely ends there. For a book that repeatedly presents its stories as true, many of the details behind those stories remain surprisingly difficult to trace. Margaret Ronan wrote The Dynamite Book of Ghosts and Haunted Houses, which was published by Scholastic in 1980. She also wrote educational books for young readers, including titles about American history and geography, and worked as an associate editor for Practical English magazine. Her interest in the paranormal can be traced back at least to 1965, when she wrote about unexplained phenomena and referenced sources such as newspaper accounts, folklore, books, and stories shared by other people. In the author's note, Ronan wrote that she had spent years collecting ghost stories. She said that some accounts came from newspaper clippings, while others came from people who claimed to have experienced the events themselves. She also mentioned living near Clarkson Street and recalled spending time in Rawlins, Wyoming, while researching the chapter, The Playroom. Ronan did not state whether she believed in ghosts. Instead, she wrote that she was still undecided and left the question to her readers. I searched newspaper archives for the book title, Margaret Ronan's name, and several of the stories included in the book. The book itself appeared only a few times. One 1981 newspaper listing showed it being added to a public library collection in Maine. Another clipping from 1986 included it among books recommended by elementary school students in New London, Connecticut. Those references show that the book continued circulating in libraries and among young readers after its 1980 publication. The search for Ronan produced more information than the search for the book. A 1965 newspaper article identified her as an associate editor of Practical English and discussed an article she had written called Things That Go Bump in the Night. The article focused on reports of unexplained activity connected to a farm near Menominee, Wisconsin. Another newspaper clipping described correspondence between Ronan and a teacher who was researching that same case. Ronan referred to earlier accounts in the Durand Times and the Religio-Philosophical Journal. She also mentioned Charles Fort's book Wild Talents and acknowledged that part of the information she had received was hearsay passed along through another person. Those clippings give us a clearer picture of how Ronan gathered material. She consulted older newspapers and books, communicated with people researching local cases, and collected stories passed down through personal accounts. That matches what she later wrote in the author's note to the Dynamite Book of Ghosts and Haunted Houses. What I couldn't find was a source list for the individual stories in the book. Searching names, locations, titles, and details from several chapters didn't produce a clear newspaper trail connecting each story to a specific article or witness. That doesn't prove the sources never existed. It only means I wasn't able to identify them through the archives I searched. The stories in the Dynamite Book of Ghosts and Haunted Houses range from famous locations to local legends that were already being passed down long before the book was published. One chapter tells the story of Resurrection Cemetery near Chicago, where drivers claim to have encountered a young woman walking along Archer Avenue late at night. Another focuses on Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, a small cemetery southwest of the city that had already gained a reputation for strange lights and unexplained sightings. Ronan also included stories set in places that readers might recognize from history books. The White House appears in one chapter, alongside accounts of presidents, staff members, and visitors who claim to have experienced unusual events. Another chapter focuses on California's Whaley House, which has been connected to ghost stories for generations. Not every story takes place in a famous location. Ronan wrote about haunted churches, phantom hitchhikers, and ordinary houses where people claim to hear footsteps, see apparitions, or witness events they couldn't explain. What connects all of these stories is that Ronan presented them as accounts that had been shared through newspapers, local traditions, and personal experiences. The book doesn't separate legend from eyewitness testimony, leaving readers to decide for themselves what to believe. Here's what we know. The Dynamite Book of Ghosts and Haunted Houses was published by Scholastic in 1980. Margaret Ronan was the author. In her author's note, she wrote that she had spent years collecting ghost stories, and that some accounts came from newspaper clippings, while others came from people who claimed to have experienced the events themselves. We also know that Ronan wrote other books, worked as an associate editor for Practical English, and had been researching paranormal topics years before the Dynamite Book of Ghosts and Haunted Houses was published. Newspaper records show that the book was circulating in libraries and schools during the 1980s, and articles from that period confirm that Ronan used newspapers, books, folklore, and personal accounts in her research. There are also things we couldn't verify. The book doesn't include a bibliography or a list of sources for individual stories. It doesn't identify which newspaper articles Ronan used or which accounts came directly from witnesses. In many cases, it's impossible to trace a specific chapter back to a specific source using the information provided in the book itself. 45 years after its publication, the Dynamite Book of Ghosts and Haunted Houses remains what it was when it first appeared on bookstore and library shelves. A collection of ghost stories that invites readers to decide for themselves what they believe. What I find most interesting about the Dynamite Book of Ghosts and Haunted Houses isn't any one story. It's the path those stories took before they reached young readers. I wasn't born yet when this book came out to see it new on the shelves, but I can imagine what it must have felt like for a young paranormal fan to see it sitting on a school library shelf or among the books available through Scholastic. The cover promised true ghost stories, and the pages opened the door to places like Resurrection Cemetery, Bachelor's Grove, the Whaley House, and other locations many readers may have been hearing about for the first time. We couldn't trace every chapter back to the newspaper clipping or witness account Ronan may have used, but we did find evidence that she had been researching unusual stories for years, and that the book continued circulating among young readers after its publication. Whether every story inside was completely accurate, based on folklore, or shaped through retelling is difficult to determine. What isn't difficult to understand is why a book like this stayed with the people who read it. Sometimes the first ghost story you discover becomes the one that starts a lifelong fascination with the unknown. What was the first scary book you remember reading? Did you ever discover a book through Scholastic that stayed with you long after you closed it? You can call the Halloween Podcast hotline and leave a voicemail at 731-400-0472. Tell me where you're from, what book you remember, and whether it helped start your love of ghosts, Halloween, or the paranormal. Your story may even be featured in a future episode. If you enjoyed today's episode of Haunted Thursday, I'd really appreciate it if you take a moment to follow the Halloween Podcast wherever you're listening. And if your podcast app lets you leave a rating or review, those really do help more Halloween lovers discover the show. You can also keep up with everything we're doing by following us on Facebook and Instagram, or by supporting the show on Patreon. Patreon members get bonus episodes, early access, and exclusive content all year long. Thanks again for listening. You guys have a good night. Sources for today's episode include The Dynamite Book of Ghosts and Haunted Houses by Margaret Ronan, published by Scholastic in 1980. Newspaper archives, library records, educational publications, and historical references connected to the stories discussed in this episode. Additional links and resources can be found in the show notes.